Hi, everyone. Welcome to Theories of Race, Part 1. So, this goes hand in hand with our discussions of assimilation and pluralism. So, I want to start with this quote by W.E.B. Du Bois, and I actually encourage you to actually pause the lecture for a second and just read the quote in its entirety. Um, the quote says, "Between me and the other world, there is ever an unasked question, unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. All nevertheless flutter around it. They approach me in a half hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then instead of saying it directly, 'How does it feel to be a problem?' they say, 'I know an excellent colored man in my town,' or 'I fought in Mechanicsville,' or 'Do not these southern outrages make your blood boil?' At these I smile, or am interested, or reduce the boiling to a simmer, as the occasion may require. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem, I seldom answer a word." I'd like you to think about this quote. W.E.B. Du Bois is one of the most preeminent writers on race in the last 150 years. And in fact, his sort of wide range of books focuses explicitly on African American experiences in the United States. This particular quote came out of The Souls of Black Folk, which is probably arguably his most famous book. And I want you to think about that question of how does it feel to be a problem? I seldom answer a word. In this quote is embedded a lot of different ideas. And it's easy to get caught up in parts of this quote where he says, where they talk about, "I fought at Mechanicsville," or "Do not these southern outrages make your blood boil?" Because those are kind of very historically specific references. But instead, we could think about that as, instead of "Do not these southern outrages make your blood boil," you could think about instead things like, um, you know, doesn't what happened to Trayvon Martin make your blood boil? Or what about Baltimore? Um, I stood with African Americans, in the South, right? That part of what he's getting at here are the very interesting ways in which we talk about race and race relations in the United States, but also embedded is this idea of victim blaming. That in some ways, African American, in this case, he's talking about African Americans, always being viewed as a problem, as opposed to others with greater sets of privileges, those who have the privileges of whiteness, those who've never been seen as an other, being seen as a problem. So think on this a little bit, because it's a really important quote that I'll come back to later in class. The focus of today's lecture is really to also go through some baseline definitions on assimilation and pluralism, as well as segmented assimilation. These are really some of the core theories within sociology where we focus on how we make sense of race and race relations. We look historically at some of the work that's been done to theorize what happens to people when they come to the United States. In other words, how do people gradually become part of society? The first theory that we're going to talk about is assimilation. Assimilation is the process by which characteristics of members of immigrant groups and host societies come to resemble one another. That process, which has both economic and sociocultural dimensions, begins with the immigrant generation and continues through the second generation and beyond. In other words, the idea of assimilation is the idea is that immigrants, eventually over time, become fully integrated into the society in which they migrated to. And by fully integrated, that's not just about kind of cultural values. That's also should be about power systems. It should be about resources, electoral politics, language, etc. And so, in other words, immigrants take on the characteristics of their host society. One of the people who really focused heavily on this idea of assimilation was Robert Park. Robert Park was part of the Chicago School, which was a set of theorists who wrote out of the University of Chicago and focused specifically on what we call urban ecology, and they were very interested specifically about race relations and how it worked in Chicago. In his race relations cycle, Robert Park emphasized migration issues. In other words, what happened to immigrant groups, and so he proposed a sort of a four-step process. It started with this idea of migration. So if you look at 12 o'clock on that diagram that you have in front of you, it starts with migration, that immigrants migrate to, in this case, the United States. They make the decision to come to the United States, to leave their home country and come to the United States. When they come to the United States, the next part of their process is that there's competition for scarce resources. In other words, immigrants enter into the mix into the society that they occupy, or that they move to, sorry, and they compete for resources that everybody needs. And so this competition that we often hear about would be competition for things like jobs. Immigrant groups are oftentimes used by those in power to to compete for jobs, to lower wages, and so historically we've seen this in industries like mining or agriculture. We see it in technology today, but the scarce resources are jobs. So they basically initially this competition, according to Park, created fragmentation. It created animosity between groups so that they remained separate. And that he posited that over time, that these groups would get to know each other, that the groups would start working together, and there would be less competition for scarce resources, and instead we would see what we call accommodation. In other words, that people would work together, that they would start sharing, because their kids oftentimes would be in the same schools, that they would start getting along more. That accommodation also meant that there would be intermarriage, that people would marry across the different races. And so a lot of the differences that we originally saw in terms of culture, economics, belief systems, religion, would eventually go away or become non-issues in society. And that eventually over time what we would see is full assimilation. Right? Meaning that we would see no differences in power and how people were treated, that the immigrant would essentially seamlessly become part of the host society. So part of what I've asked you to do this week in your homework is to think through whether this is a viable theory, if this was something that in fact actually happened. And I'll discuss this a little bit more as we move forward, because I want you to think through this. Do immigrants eventually become fully integrated into host society? And I think that therein lies the critique. Because again, remember, integration is at all levels. It's economic. It means a full sharing of resources, intermarriage, taking on cultural values, and that you have and that essentially you would end up be part of what we call the melting pot. And so under assimilation theory, they use the analogy of the melting pot where, and you probably have heard this a lot growing up in your history classes, where in a melting pot, people from various cultures come to America and contribute aspects of their culture to create a new, unique American culture. So if you look at the graphic on the right there, the idea is that what it means to be American means that you take on parts of the Chinese culture, the Irish culture, the Italian culture, the Mexican culture, the Russian culture, etc., etc. That what it means to be American is all of these things. And that the result is that contributions from many cultures are indistinguishable from one another and are effectively melted and melded together. And I would expect that most of you, through even your own understandings of history, would understand that there are some problems in this theory. That at least at a base level, we know that full integration hasn't happened. We don't necessarily see the melding of cultures, and in fact, from a historical standpoint, we also know that if we were truly to have taken on the host country's cultures when we immigrated, then most of us should be much more like Native American cultures than any other. But we also know that that's not true. So think through that, and the chapter talks quite a bit about this. But you should be able to pull out a set of critiques that I'll talk about as we move forward. Our next theory that we talk about is cultural pluralism. Um, Basically, theorists who started talking about pluralism basically said, well, you know what? Assimilation as a theory doesn't quite work. What we know is that there are times when newly arrived immigrants do not lose the unique aspects of their cultures, like in the melting pot model, and instead they retain them. You could see this here in Sacramento. If you just travel south here in South Sac, for example, we see that the Vietnamese community, for example, if you travel straight down Franklin Boulevard, the Vietnamese community has retained a great deal of its culture. We see churches, we see community based organizations, we see stores, we see very specific types of shops that cater to needs of this immigrant group. We still that throughout Sacramento we hear people speaking different languages, and then in some cases we know that they're monolingual in only that English in that language and don't speak English. So in other words, what we find is that rather than full on integration, we see that some groups retain their culture. And so theorists were basically saying, well, wait a minute, there's numerous reasons why this doesn't happen. Assimilation doesn't happen for numerous reasons because some people are excluded from particular jobs, some are excluded from particular resources, that the schools in and of themselves aren't equipped to actually provide things like bilingual education. Um, that some groups choose both cultures, meaning that they are effectively bicultural. That they not only take on American culture, but that they also they retain their own culture. The unique characteristics of each culture are still identifiable within the larger American society, much like the ingredients in a salad are still identifiable, yet contribute to the overall makeup of the salad bowl. So with cultural pluralism, they like to use this analogy of the salad, where on the one hand you have your distinct vegetables, but on the whole, we can look at it as a whole, where they're also American. Oftentimes, they use cultural pluralism as a reason why we have sort of the hyphenated identities. It accounts for the retention of the quote unquote something American, like Chinese American, Mexican American, etc. That this identifies that someone affiliates with multiple different identities. And this idea under cultural pluralism, however, is that despite retaining your distinct cultural attributes, that you were also supposed to be fully functional in American society, meaning that you have equal access to power, equal access to resources like jobs. We should see no economic differentials across groups. And we know that that hasn't happened as well. And so pluralism in and of itself also is a faulty theory that doesn't account for things, namely like power. And the fact that that what we often find is that differences across groups are also about struggles over power. The next theory that we also look at is something called segmented assimilation, and that this is something that's really carried out over a couple of generations. The first generation is the generation that migrates to the United States. The second generation are basically their children, those who were born here in the United States. The idea of segmented assimilation is the idea that individuals will either choose to identify with their culture or not. Sometimes they identify with both the United States culture and their own culture, and sometimes they give up one or the other. The idea under segmented assimilation is that you want to have a sense of belonging to an ethnic group and the part of one's thinking, perceptions, feelings, and behavior that is due to ethnic group membership. And so if you choose to retain that sense of belonging with an ethnic group, you will go into a very specific segment of society. That, in other words, it's a tier. And that oftentimes what we need to account for in theory, according to these theorists, is that what happens if you feel affiliations or loyalties to multiple groups? And that also creates another set of tiers. So here, in this next slide right here, what you see is that segmented assimilationists basically argue that each of these different squares represent an area that someone can kind of assimilate into, and each of these are at a different level, and that essentially you can plot someone's identity onto these axes. And so you basically would divide, like much like a mathematical equation, you would divide things into quadrants. In that top left area, you know in the um, sorry in this very sort of first area, what you begin to see is that you would plot someone as who has what we call low ethnicity and low culture, meaning that this is somebody who doesn't affiliate with their ethnic group, but also rejects all things that are part of the United States. That they basically essentially disassociate with all of the different cultures. These theorists have argued that a lot of times this is where you see groups get into criminal behaviors. They reject both their family as well as U.S. society. And so they would plot them where that triangle is right there as low ethnicity and low culture. The next group would be someone who has high ethnicity and low culture. And so for these theorists, they basically argued that this represents groups of people who held on to who held on to their ethnic identity. So if this is someone who was Mexican American, is that they highly associate with being Mexican, right? But they sort of reject the American side of it. This would mean that maybe they don't speak the language. They choose not to. They choose not to associate with certain cultural practices, or they retain ones from their home country. This could be very religious. This could be language. It could be other celebrations of culture. It could also be about different sort of gendered understandings. But high ethnicity, low culture basically means that they stay very tightly knit to just their ethnic culture. Now, high ethnicity, high culture, this is a group that we call bicultural. This is a group that is highly functional both in U.S. society and U.S. cultural norms, as well as in their own home countries' cultural norms and belief systems. So these individuals will tend to be bilingual. They will speak, like we're going to stay with our analogy of Mexican Americans, they would speak both Spanish and English. They would understand the political systems of both countries. They would understand the sort of social norms and belief systems. They would be able to understand power and power relations in both systems. In other words, they're fully functional in both societies. And then this final group is a group that we call low ethnicity and high culture. This is a group that basically rejects their ethnic culture. This is a group that basically becomes what we might say fully Americanized. They don't speak the language of their parents. And so if we're going to stay with sort of Mexican American analogy, they don't speak Spanish. They decide to be completely unaware of the sort of social norms and belief systems and oftentimes religion, and they fully accept just U.S. society and only practice those things. So under this particular theory of segmented assimilation, these individuals, what these theorists basically argue that you would fit into one of these categories. The hard part is that in any time you create categories like this, there are those people who don't quite fit in, that you can't really plot on a graph anywhere. This also doesn't necessarily talk about power relations, how external forces can create fragmentation in communities. This also doesn't talk about just even over generations, how change happens, how history happens. So there are also some flaws in terms of this theory. So I'm going to stop there after covering these three theories, and then we're going to move forward with the next one in the next lecture.